in the serene halls of St. Mary's Grange, a chilling nursery rhyme whispers of death. A torn page from Sing a Song of Sixpence lies on the drawing-room table, its words underlined in blood-red ink, 24 blackbirds. Why does this childish rhyme haunt the elegant guests at a lavish summer gathering? When Captain Lionel Harrow is found dead, struck down by a brass candlestick, the question burns, who among this closed circle of secrets is a killer? Enter Miss Jane Marple and Hercule Poirot, their sharp minds unravelling a tapestry of lies, betrayal, and greed. Will the nursery rhyme reveal the murderer, or is it a trap to hide a darker truth? Chapter 1. The Quiet of St. Mary's Grange. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of St. Mary's Grange, a sprawling estate nestled in the heart of the English countryside. The air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, and the gentle hum of bees provided a deceptive calm to the scene. To an outsider, the Grange appeared the very picture of serene gentility, a place where time moved slowly, and secrets were buried beneath layers of propriety. But beneath this tranquil veneer, a storm was brewing, one that would soon draw the attention of the inimitable Miss Jane Marple. The Grange was the ancestral home of the Ashford family, a lineage once renowned for its wealth and influence, but now diminished to a mere shadow of its former glory. The current occupant, Sir Reginald Ashford, was a man of 60, whose stern demeanour and rigid adherence to tradition masked a deep unease about the family's dwindling fortunes. His wife, Lady Beatrice, a woman of delicate health and sharper wit, presided over the household with an air of resigned elegance. Their only daughter, Clara, was a bright, wilful young woman of 25, whose modern ideas often clashed with her father's old-world sensibilities. This particular weekend, the Grange was alive with guests, invited under the pretence of a summer gathering to celebrate Clara's recent engagement to Captain Lionel Harrow, a dashing naval officer with a reputation for charm and ambition. The guest list was a carefully curated mix of old friends, distant relatives, and local notables, each bringing their own complexities to the delicate social tapestry. Among them were Dr. Ernest Caldwell, the family physician with a penchant for gossip; Mrs. Lavinia Trent, a widowed cousin whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper memory; and Mr. Percival Blake, a solicitor whose quiet demeanour belied a mind as calculating as any chess master. There was also Miss Eleanor Price, Clara's former governess, now a spinster of uncertain means, and the Reverend Thomas Ward, whose pious exterior hid a surprising fondness for cards. The day had begun with the usual pleasantries: tea on the terrace, croquet on the lawn, and murmured conversations about the weather and the state of the nation. But as evening approached, a peculiar tension settled over the group. It began with a seemingly trivial incident: the discovery of a torn page from a nursery rhyme book, left on the drawing-room table. The page bore the words of Sing a Song of Sixpence, with the line about the maid's nose being snipped off underlined in red ink. Clara, ever the spirited one, laughed it off as a prank, but Miss Marple, who had arrived that afternoon at the invitation of Lady Beatrice, noted the unease that flickered across the faces of the other guests. Miss Jane Marple, with her soft white hair, twinkling eyes, and unassuming air, was often underestimated by those who did not know her. To the casual observer, She was merely a kindly old spinster from St. Mary Mead, fond of knitting and village gossip. But those who had crossed paths with her before knew better. Her mind, sharp as a razor, had an uncanny ability to unravel the most tangled of human motives, and her observations of human nature, gleaned from years of watching the quiet dramas of village life, made her a formidable detective. She had been invited to the Grange as a gesture of courtesy, for Lady Beatrice had once been a schoolmate of Miss Marple's cousin. But it was clear to Jane that her presence was not entirely welcome among the younger set. As the guests gathered in the drawing-room before dinner, Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the room. Sir Reginald stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of controlled irritation, as he discussed estate matters with Mr. Blake. Lady Beatrice, seated on a velvet chaise, fanned herself delicately, her eyes darting nervously toward Clara, who was laughing too loudly at something Captain Harrow had said. Dr. Caldwell, meanwhile, was regaling Mrs. Trent with a tale of a recent medical case, though his eyes kept straying to the nursery rhyme page, now tucked into a book on the side table. Miss Eleanor Price sat alone, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while the Reverend Ward sipped his sherry and murmured platitudes about the virtues of charity. The atmosphere was polite but strained, as if each person were guarding a secret they dared not share. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the small details, the way Sir Reginald's fingers tightened around his glass when Clara mentioned her plans to travel abroad after the wedding. The fleeting glance of resentment Mrs. Trent cast toward Lady Beatrice. The nervous tick in Dr. Caldwell's cheek when Captain Harrow mentioned a recent naval promotion. And then there was the nursery rhyme page, its presence an oddity that no one seemed eager to discuss. Dinner was announced at precisely 7 o'clock, and the guests moved to the dining room, where a long mahogany table gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier. The meal was a lavish affair: roast pheasant, creamed potatoes, and a delicate asparagus soup, but the conversation was stilted, punctuated by awkward silences. Miss Marple, seated between the Reverend Ward and Miss Price, listened more than she spoke, her mind cataloguing every word, every gesture. She noted that Clara, seated at the far end of the table, seemed unusually subdued, her eyes fixed on her plate rather than her fiancé. Captain Harrow, for his part, was all charm, regaling the table with tales of his naval exploits, though Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality to his anecdotes. It was just as the dessert course was being served, a rich plum pudding, that the first hint of true discord emerged. Mrs. Trent, perhaps emboldened by her third glass of wine, made a pointed remark about Clara's engagement, suggesting that Captain Harrow's prospects were rather too good to be true. The comment drew a sharp intake of breath from Lady Beatrice, and a flush of anger from Clara. Sir Reginald, ever the patriarch, attempted to steer the conversation to safer waters, but the damage was done. The nursery rhyme page, mentioned again by Mrs. Trent, in a half-joking tone, cast a shadow over the table, its cryptic message lingering like an unwelcome guest. As the meal concluded and the guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple excused herself to take a turn about the garden. The night was cool, the stars bright above the dark silhouette of the Grange. She walked slowly, her mind turning over the events of the evening. The nursery rhyme page was no mere prank, she was certain. Its placement, its underlined words, suggested a deliberate act, a warning perhaps, or a taunt. And then there was the undercurrent of tension among the guests, jealousies, resentments, and unspoken fears. Miss Marple knew from experience that such emotions, when left unchecked, could lead to something far darker than a torn page. As she re-entered the house, she heard a muffled cry from the direction of the library. Quickening her pace, she arrived to find the guests gathered around the door, their faces pale with shock. On the floor of the library, sprawled beside a toppled chair, lay Captain Lionel Harrow, his eyes wide and lifeless, a thin trickle of blood seeping from a wound at his temple. A heavy brass candlestick lay nearby, its base stained red. Clara, trembling, clung to her mother, while Sir Reginald barked orders to the servants to fetch the police. Miss Marple stepped forward, her calm demeanour a stark contrast to the chaos around her. She knelt beside the body, her eyes taking in every detail. The position of the candlestick, the angle of the wound, the faint smear of lipstick on Captain Harrow's collar. The nursery rhyme page, she noted, was now missing from the drawing-room table. As the guests whispered and wept, Miss Marple's mind began to work, her little grey cells piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that would soon consume them all. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Crime. The library at St. Mary's Grange, usually a haven of leather-bound books and polished oak, was now a scene of grim disarray. Captain Lionel Harrow's body lay where it had fallen, the brass candlestick a mute testament to the violence that had shattered the evening's civility. The air was thick with the scent of old books and the metallic tang of blood, and the guests huddled just outside the door wore expressions ranging from shock to suspicion. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly to one side, her small frame almost lost in the shadows, her eyes moving methodically over the scene as the household descended into chaos. Sir Reginald Ashford, his face ashen but his voice steady, had taken charge, ordering the servants to secure the room and prevent anyone from entering until the police arrived. Lady Beatrice, her delicate composure fraying, clutched Clara's arm, her whispered reassurances doing little to quell her daughter's trembling. Clara herself was a study in contrasts, her eyes red with tears, yet her jaw set with a defiance that suggested she was not entirely overcome by grief. The other guests hovered nearby, their murmurs a low hum of speculation and fear. Dr. Ernest Caldwell knelt briefly by the body, confirming what was already evident. Captain Harrow was dead, his skull fractured by a single forceful blow. Miss Marple, unnoticed by most, took careful note of the room's details. The library was a large rectangular space with tall windows overlooking the garden, now dark under the night sky. A heavy oak desk stood against one wall, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkwell, and a silver letter opener. The candlestick, its base smeared with blood, lay near a Persian rug, which was slightly askew, as if disturbed in a struggle. A single book, a collection of nursery rhymes, lay open on a side table, its pages fluttering faintly in the draught from an open window. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the book, recalling the torn page from Sing a Song of Sixpence that had so unsettled the gathering earlier. It was gone now, and she suspected its absence was no accident. The local constable, a young man named Perkins, arrived shortly after, his flustered demeanour betraying his inexperience with such matters. He was followed by Inspector Grayson, a dour, methodical man from the county police, who took one look at the scene and began barking orders. The guests were ushered into the drawing-room, where they sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting to one another as if seeking the guilty party among them. Miss Marple, invited to join them, chose a chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm as she listened to the inspector's preliminary questions. Inspector Grayson began with Clara, whose engagement to the victim made her an obvious starting point. "Miss Ashford," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "when did you last see Captain Harrow alive?" Clara's voice was steady, though her hands twisted a handkerchief into knots. "At dinner, Inspector. We all dined together. Lionel was, himself, charming and full of stories. After dessert, he said he was going to the library to fetch a book he'd promised to show me. I stayed in the drawing-room with the others." "And you heard nothing unusual? No raised voices, no sounds of a struggle?" Grayson pressed. Clara shook her head. "Nothing. I was talking with Mother and Mrs. Trent. The first I knew of this was when we heard the cry." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Clara's account was clear, but there was a hesitancy in her tone, a slight tightening of her lips that suggested she was holding something back. Miss Marple made a mental note to revisit this later. The inspector moved on to Sir Reginald, who confirmed that he had been in the study, going over accounts with Mr. Blake, the solicitor. "We heard nothing until the scream," Sir Reginald said, his voice clipped. "I assumed it was one of the maids dropping a tray until I saw him." Mr. Blake nodded in agreement, his pale face betraying his discomfort. "We were discussing estate matters. The study is at the far end of the hall, too far to hear anything from the library." Lady Beatrice, when questioned, admitted to feeling faint after dinner and retiring to her room briefly before rejoining the others in the drawing-room. "I was with Clara and Mrs. Trent when we heard the cry," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Mrs. Lavinia Trent, however, was less reticent. "I'll tell you what I think, Inspector," she said, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of indignation and relish. "There's bad blood in this house. Always has been. That nursery rhyme nonsense earlier. It wasn't a prank. Someone meant to stir things up, and now look what's happened." Inspector Grayson raised an eyebrow, but made no comment, turning instead to Dr. Caldwell. The doctor, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, confirmed he had been in the drawing-room, chatting with the Reverend Ward. "I'm no expert in forensics," he said, "but that blow was delivered with force. Whoever did it meant to kill." The Reverend Ward, his face pale but composed, nodded. "I was with Dr. Caldwell. We were discussing the parish fundraiser. I heard nothing until Miss Price screamed." Miss Eleanor Price, the former governess, flushed at the mention of her name. "I went to the library to find a book," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw him lying there and screamed. I didn't touch anything, I swear." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Miss Price's hands were trembling, and her story, while plausible, lacked detail. Why had she gone to the library at that precise moment? And why had she seemed so nervous all evening? As the inspector continued his questions, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The nursery rhyme book, open to a different page now, was a curious detail. The sheer candlestick, heavy and ornate, was an unlikely weapon of opportunity. Most people would have chosen the letter opener on the desk, which was sharper and closer to hand. And then there was the open window, its latch undone, suggesting the possibility of an outsider, though the estate's remote location made that unlikely. The interviews concluded. Inspector Grayson announced that no one was to leave the Grange until further notice. The guests murmured their assent, though their faces betrayed their unease. As they dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her knitting abandoned for the moment. She approached the side table where the nursery rhyme book had been earlier, now replaced by a vase of roses. She bent down, her sharp eyes catching a faint glint beneath the table. A tiny scrap of paper, torn and crumpled, bearing the words 24 blackbirds. Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her reticule, her expression unchanged. The police, she knew, would focus on the obvious, the candlestick, the alibis, the motives of jealousy or greed. But Miss Marple saw something deeper, a pattern emerging from the chaos. The nursery rhyme was no mere eccentricity. It was a thread in a tapestry of deception, one she intended to unravel. As she retired to her room, the clock in the hall struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the silent house. Miss Marple sat by her window, gazing out at the darkened garden. Somewhere in St. Mary's Grange, a killer was hiding, their motives cloaked in the polite veneer of this closed circle. And Miss Marple, with her little grey cells and her unerring sense of human nature, was already beginning to see the shape of their secret. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Order. The morning after Captain Harrow's murder dawned grey and heavy. The sky over St. Mary's Grange cloaked in a mist that seemed to mirror the unease within the house. The guests, confined to the estate by Inspector Grayson's orders, moved through breakfast with a subdued air, their conversation stilted and their glances wary. The dining room, so resplendent the previous evening, now felt oppressive. Its long table, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end with a cup of tea and a slice of toast, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet intensity, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. Sir Reginald, his face drawn and his eyes shadowed, presided over the meal with a grim determination to maintain decorum. Lady Beatrice, pale and fragile, picked at her food, her gaze flickering nervously toward Clara, who sat with her hands clasped tightly, her engagement ring glinting in the dim light. The other guests, Dr. Caldwell, Mrs. Trent, Mr. Blake, Miss Price, and the Reverend Ward, ate in near silence, their usual chatter replaced by an uneasy tension. The absence of Captain Harrow, so vibrant and commanding the night before, hung over the table like a spectre. Miss D. Marple's thoughts, however, were not on the strained atmosphere, but on the scrap of paper she had found the previous night, now tucked safely in her reticule. The words 24 blackbirds from the nursery rhyme Sing a Song of Sixpence were a curious clue, one that suggested a deliberate mind at work. She had not mentioned it to Inspector Grayson, whose methodical but unimaginative approach she found limiting. The inspector, she suspected, would see the murder as a crime of passion or greed, but Miss Marple sensed something more intricate. A puzzle woven with intention, its threads hidden in the ordinary details of the Grange's inhabitants. As breakfast concluded, a knock at the front door announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The butler, a stoic man named Hawkins, ushered in a small, impeccably dressed figure whose presence seemed to bring a sudden clarity to the room. It was not, as the guests might have expected, another policeman, but Hercule Poirot, the renowned Belgian detective, whose reputation for solving the most perplexing crimes preceded him. His neat moustache, polished shoes, and air of fastidious confidence were unmistakable, and his arrival caused a ripple of surprise among the guests. "Mon Dieu," Poirot said, bowing slightly as he entered the dining room, his sharp eyes taking in every face. "I regret to intrude upon such a sombre occasion, but I have been summoned by a friend of the family who believes my little grey cells may be of service." Sir Reginald rose, his expression a mix of relief and irritation. "Summoned? By whom, may I ask?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "A mutual acquaintance, Sir Reginald, who wishes to remain discreet. Suffice it to say, I am here to assist Inspector Grayson in unravelling this unfortunate affair." Inspector Grayson, who had joined the group moments earlier, frowned but nodded. "Any help is welcome, Mr. Poirot, though I assure you we have the matter in hand. The facts are clear. Captain Harrow was struck down in the library between 9 and 10 last night. The candlestick was the weapon, and we're working to establish alibis." Poirot's eyes twinkled with polite skepticism. "The facts, Inspector, are like the pieces of a puzzle, clear only when arranged in the correct order. May I see the scene of the crime?" With a grudging nod, Grayson led Poirot to the library, followed by Miss Marple, who had quietly slipped into the group. The room was much as it had been the previous night, though the body had been removed for examination. The candlestick, now bagged as evidence, had been replaced by a chalk outline on the rug. Poirot moved with deliberate care, his gloved hands clasped behind his back as he examined the desk, the open window, and the nursery rhyme book still lying open on the side table. "Curieux," Poirot murmured, bending to inspect the book. "This page, 3 blind mice, is not the one you mentioned last night, is it, Mademoiselle Marple?" Miss Marple, who had been watching him closely, gave a small nod. "No, Monsieur Poirot. The page last night was from Sing-a-Song of Sixpence. It was torn out and left on the drawing-room table, with a line underlined in red." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "And this torn page, it is now missing. I found a fragment of it," Miss Marple said, producing the scrap from her reticule. "Beneath the drawing-room table. The rest, I fear, has been taken." Poirot examined the scrap, his expression unreadable. 24 blackbirds, a most intriguing choice. This is no random act, mademoiselle. The killer wishes to play a game, to taunt us with their cleverness." Inspector Grayson, overhearing, scoffed. "A game? This is a murder, Mr. Poirot, not a parlour trick. We're dealing with a blunt instrument and a room full of suspects, not nursery rhymes." Poirot's smile was patient. The mind of the criminal inspector is rarely so straightforward. The nursery rhyme is a clue, a signature perhaps. We must ask ourselves, why this rhyme? Why this moment? As Grayson turned to confer with Constable Perkins, Poirot drew Miss Marple aside. "You have observed these people, mademoiselle? What do your little grey cells tell you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a rare amusement. "I am but a simple woman, Monsieur Poirot, but I have noticed tensions." Clara, for instance, was not as heartbroken as one might expect of a fiancée. And Mrs. Trent's remarks at dinner were not merely spiteful. They carried a weight, as if she knew something she dared not say outright. Poirot nodded approvingly. "You see much, mademoiselle. I, too, have observed. The candlestick is too heavy, too awkward for a spontaneous act, and the window open just so. It suggests a possibility, no? An outsider, perhaps, or a deliberate misdirection." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Caldwell, who had been summoned to provide a preliminary report. "The blow was struck with considerable force," he said, mopping his brow. "Death was instantaneous, likely between 9:15 and 9:30. There's a faint bruise on the captain's wrist, as if someone grabbed him before the blow." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A struggle, then? And the lipstick on his collar, did you note its shade, Doctor?" Caldwell blinked, caught off guard. "Lipstick? Well, it was a bright red, I suppose. Not unusual for a man of his charm." "Perhaps," Poirot said, his tone neutral, "but in a house of secrets, every detail matters." As the morning wore on, Poirot began his interviews, starting with the servants. Hawkins, the butler, confirmed that the library window had been closed during dinner, suggesting it was opened after the meal. A maid, Jenny, admitted to seeing Miss Price near the library shortly before the scream, but insisted she had seen nothing suspicious. Poirot listened, his head tilted, his questions gentle but piercing, as if peeling back layers of truth with each word. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to the drawing-room, where the guests were gathered under the watchful eye of Constable Perkins. She noted the way Clara avoided her mother's gaze, the way Mrs. Trent's fingers twitched as if longing to reveal more, and the way Mr. Blake's calm exterior seemed to mask a deeper unease. The nursery rhyme, she thought, was not just a clue, but a key to the killer's mind, and to the secrets that bound this circle of suspects together. As Poirot rejoined the group, his eyes met Miss Marple's, and a silent understanding passed between them. The game had begun, and the little grey cells of two great minds were now aligned against a killer who believed themselves untouchable. But in the quiet of St. Mary's Grange, where every word and glance held meaning, the truth was already beginning to stir. Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary's Grange bathed in pale sunlight that did little to dispel the chill of suspicion lingering among its inhabitants. The drawing-room, where the guests were confined under Inspector Grayson's orders, was a study in strained civility. The clink of teacups and the rustle of newspapers provided a thin veneer of normalcy, but every glance, every whispered aside, carried the weight of unspoken accusations. Miss Jane Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes missing nothing as she observed the restless assembly. Hercule Poirot, with his meticulous air and unyielding gaze, had taken command of the room's attention, his presence a catalyst for the unravelling of secrets. Poirot had requested to interview each guest individually, a process Inspector Grayson permitted with a grudging nod, provided Constable Perkins remained present to take notes. The library, now cleared of its grim contents, served as the setting for these interrogations, its high shelves and heavy curtains lending an air of solemnity. Poirot stood by the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his moustache twitching slightly as he prepared to probe the minds of those who had dined with Captain Harrow on the night of his death. First to be questioned was Clara Ashford, whose engagement to the victim made her a focal point of interest. She entered the library with a defiant tilt of her chin, though her hands betrayed her nerves, twisting the hem of her cardigan. Poirot gestured to a chair, his manner courteous but firm. "Mademoiselle Ashford," he began, his voice smooth as polished glass, "you were to marry Captain Harrow. Yet last night you seemed, how shall I say, less than devastated by his loss. Why is this?" Clara's eyes flashed, but she composed herself quickly. "I loved Lionel, Monsieur Poirot, but I'm not one for hysterics. I was in shock, that's all. We were in the drawing-room when it happened. I didn't hear anything until Miss Price screamed." Poirot nodded, his gaze lingering on her engagement ring, a sapphire that caught the light with a cold gleam. "And this nursery rhyme page, the one with a sing-a-song of sixpence. You laughed when it was found. Why?" "It seemed silly," Clara said, her voice sharp. "A childish prank. I didn't think it meant anything." "Yet now we have a murder," Poirot said, his tone gentle but probing. "And the page is gone. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Captain Harrow have enemies? Someone who might wish him harm?" Clara hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "Lionel was ambitious. He made enemies easily, but no one here would— I can't imagine it." Poirot's eyes narrowed, catching the flicker of uncertainty in her words. He dismissed her politely, but Miss Marple, who had been permitted to observe from a corner, noted the way Clara's shoulders relaxed as she left, as if she had narrowly escaped a trap. Next came Sir Reginald, his stern features set in a mask of impatience. "I've told the inspector everything," he said brusquely. "I was in the study with Blake, going over accounts. I heard nothing until the scream." Poirot tilted his head, his expression one of polite curiosity. "And your daughter's engagement, Sir Reginald, was it to your liking? Captain Harrow was perhaps not the son-in-law you envisioned?" Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. He was a fine man, but his prospects were uncertain. "I had concerns, yes, but nothing to do with murder." "Yet you argued with him yesterday," Poirot said, his voice deceptively mild. "A servant overheard raised voices in the garden before dinner. What was the subject?" Sir Reginald flushed. "A family matter. Clara's future, her inheritance. It was nothing sinister." Poirot let the matter drop, but Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Sir Reginald's discomfort was palpable, and she wondered what family matter could provoke such a reaction in a man so accustomed to control. Lady Beatrice was next, her delicate frame swathed in a shawl as she took her seat. Her answers were soft, almost too soft, as if she feared her words might betray her. "I was in my room after dinner, feeling unwell," she said. "I rejoined the others just before the scream. I know nothing of what happened." "And the nursery rhyme page," Poirot said. "Did it disturb you, madame?" Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened on her shawl. "It was unsettling, but I thought it was Clara's idea of a joke. She's always been fond of theatrics." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Lady Beatrice's tone suggested more than maternal indulgence. There was a hint of reproach, as if Clara's behaviour was a source of ongoing concern. Mrs. Lavinia Trent entered with a flourish, her sharp tongue barely restrained. "This is a house of secrets, Monsieur Poirot," she declared. "I told them that rhyme was no accident. Someone here is playing a dangerous game." "And who do you suspect, madame?" Poirot asked, his eyes gleaming. Mrs. Trent leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Clara's no grieving widow, mark my words. And that governess, Miss Price, she's too quiet, always watching. I wouldn't trust her an inch." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "You see much, madame. But tell me, what is your own secret? Why such animosity toward the Ashfords?" Mrs. Trent bristled but said nothing, her silence as telling as her words. Miss Marple noted the way her hands clenched, as if holding back a flood of grievances. Dr. Caldwell, Mr. Blake, Miss Price, and the Reverend Ward followed, each offering their version of the evening's events. The doctor admitted to noticing the lipstick on Harrow's collar, but dismissed it as irrelevant. Mr. Blake, the solicitor, was reserved, claiming he had been with Sir Reginald the entire time. Miss Price repeated her story of finding the body, her voice trembling, while the Reverend Ward spoke of his conversation with Dr. Caldwell, his pious tone tinged with unease. Poirot's questions were precise, designed to elicit contradictions or hesitations. He asked about the nursery rhyme book, the open window, the candlestick's weight, and the exact timing of each guest's movements. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, admired his technique. Each query was a thread, tugging gently at the fabric of the suspect's stories, revealing tiny tears in their alibis. As the interviews concluded, Poirot and Miss Marple stepped into the garden for a private word. The air was cool, the roses heavy with dew. "What do you make of it, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his voice low. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "They're all hiding something, Monsieur Poirot. Clara's grief is not what it seems, and Mrs. Trent knows more than she says. The nursery rhyme, I think, is a message, a challenge to us, perhaps, or to someone in this house." Poirot nodded, his fingers brushing his moustache. "Oui, a challenge. The killer is clever, but not as clever as they believe. The candlestick, the window, the rhyme, they are pieces of a puzzle, but the true key lies in the human heart. We must watch, mademoiselle, and listen." As they returned to the house, Miss Marple's mind turned to the scrap of paper in her reticule. The 24 blackbirds were a clue, but to what? A motive, a method, or something deeper? The game, as Poirot had called it, was growing more intricate, and Miss Marple knew that the next move would require all her cunning to anticipate. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the tall windows of St. Mary's Grange. But the warmth did little to ease the growing tension among the guests. The drawing-room, where they remained confined under Inspector Grayson's watchful eye, buzzed with whispered speculations and sidelong glances. The murder of Captain Lionel Harrow had transformed the polite gathering into a nest of suspicion, and each guest seemed to carry the weight of their own secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm, her eyes sharp as she observed the interplay of fear and deception. Hercule Poirot, meanwhile, paced the room with a restless energy, his mind clearly at work, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle laid before him. Inspector Grayson, determined to assert his authority, had taken a blunt approach to the investigation, focusing on what he considered the most obvious suspect, Clara Ashford. Her engagement to the victim, combined with her subdued reaction to his death, made her an easy target for his suspicions. Miss Ashford, he said, his voice carrying across the room as he addressed her in front of the others. "You stand to inherit a considerable sum upon your marriage. With Captain Harrow gone, that inheritance remains yours alone. Care to explain why you were seen arguing with him in the garden yesterday afternoon?" Clara's face flushed, her eyes narrowing. "That's absurd, Inspector. I loved Lionel. Our argument was about trivial matters, wedding plans, nothing more." "Trivial?" Grayson pressed, holding up a letter he had retrieved from the library desk. "This was found among Captain Harrow's papers. It's a draft of a new will, naming you as the sole beneficiary of his naval pension and investments. If he died before the wedding, you'd gain everything without the inconvenience of a husband." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Lavinia Trent's lips curled into a knowing smirk, while Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sir Reginald's face darkened, and Mr. Blake, the solicitor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze fixed on Clara, whose composure faltered for a moment before she straightened. "That proves nothing," Clara said, her voice steady but strained. "Lionel was generous. He wanted to secure my future. You're twisting it into something sinister." Poirot, who had been listening silently, stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Inspector, if I may," he said, his tone polite but firm. "The letter is indeed significant, but it is not the whole story. A will benefits only if the beneficiary knows of its existence. Did you, Mademoiselle Ashford, know of this document?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her handkerchief. "No," she said finally, "Lionel never mentioned it." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Curieux. A man writes a will, yet keeps it secret from his fiancée. We must ask why." Inspector Grayson, undeterred, turned his attention to another guest. Miss Eleanor Price, the former governess, whose nervous demeanour and proximity to the library at the time of the murder had not gone unnoticed. "Miss Price," he said, "you claim you went to the library to fetch a book, yet you were seen lingering near the door earlier in the evening. And that scream! You were quick to raise the alarm. Too quick, perhaps." Miss Price's hands trembled, her face paling. I told you. I found him like that. I didn't see anyone else. I screamed because I was shocked." "Shocked or guilty?" Grayson said, his voice heavy with insinuation. "You were Captain Harrow's confidant, weren't you? A governess who stayed on long after her duties ended. Perhaps you resented his engagement to Miss Ashford. Jealousy is a powerful motive." The accusation hung in the air, and Miss Price's eyes filled with tears. "That's cruel," she whispered. "I cared for Clara like a sister. I would never harm anyone." Poirot raised a hand, his expression one of gentle reproach. "Inspector, the emotions of Mademoiselle Price are genuine, but let us not leap to conclusions. The heart may weep, yet the mind may conceal. We must look to the facts, the candlestick, the open window, the nursery rhyme." Miss Marple, who had remained silent, noted the way Miss Price's hands clutched her skirt, as if anchoring herself against the storm of accusations. She also observed Mrs. Trent, whose smug expression suggested she relished the governess's discomfort. The nursery rhyme, Miss Marple thought, was the key to unravelling this tangle of motives, but its meaning remained elusive. As Grayson continued to press his theories, Poirot took a different approach, wandering the room and engaging the guests in seemingly casual conversation. He spoke to Dr. Caldwell about the bruise on Captain Harrow's wrist, noting the doctor's nervous habit of adjusting his glasses when questioned. He asked Mr. Blake about the estate's financial troubles, eliciting a curt response about client confidentiality. With the Reverend Ward, Poirot discussed the parish fundraiser, subtly probing the clergyman's whereabouts after dinner, to which Ward replied with a vague account of prayerful reflection in the conservatory. Miss Marple, watching Poirot's method, admired his ability to disarm with charm while planting seeds of doubt. She herself took a quieter approach, engaging Lady Beatrice in a conversation about the Grange's history. "Such a lovely home," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "But it must be a burden, maintaining it. I imagine Sir Reginald feels the weight of it keenly." Lady Beatrice's smile was strained. "Oh, yes. Reginald is devoted to the estate, but times have changed. Clara's marriage was meant to secure our future." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, filing away the hint of desperation in Lady Beatrice's voice. The family's financial straits, she suspected, were a thread worth pulling. As the afternoon wore on, a new piece of evidence emerged. Constable Perkins, searching the garden, discovered a cigarette case near the library window, engraved with the initials L.H., Lionel Harrows. It was scratched and dented, as if dropped in haste. Grayson seized upon it as proof of an outsider's involvement, theorizing that a stranger had entered through the window, killed Harrow, and fled. But Poirot, examining the case, shook his head. "The scratches are old, Inspector, not fresh. This was placed here, perhaps to mislead us." Miss Marple, standing nearby, agreed silently. The cigarette case was a clumsy red herring, too obvious to be the work of a careful killer. She thought again of the nursery rhyme fragment, 24 blackbirds, and wondered if it pointed to a specific person or motive. The rhyme, she recalled, spoke of deception, of things hidden in plain sight. Was the killer taunting them with their own cleverness? Or was the rhyme a clue to something more personal? By evening, Grayson's focus on Clara and Miss Price had stirred resentment among the guests who felt unfairly targeted. Mrs. Trent, ever vocal, declared the investigation a farce, while Sir Reginald demanded progress. Poirot, undeterred, gathered the group in the drawing-room, his eyes scanning their faces. "Mes amis," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "The truth lies not in the obvious, but in the subtle. The candlestick, the rhyme, the window, these are not accidents. They are the work of a mind that plans, that calculates. I ask you to reflect. What do you hide?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but heavy with implication. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, saw the flicker of fear in several pairs of eyes. The red herrings, Clara's inheritance, Miss Price's scream, the cigarette case, were distractions, she was certain. The real truth lay deeper, in the secrets each guest guarded, and in the nursery rhyme that seemed to mock them all. As the group dispersed for dinner, Miss Marple and Poirot exchanged a glance. "The killer is among us, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, "and they believe themselves safe, but the little grey cells, they do not rest." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning to the next piece of the puzzle. The game was far from over, and the shadows of St. Mary's Grange held more secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The evening at St. Mary's Grange settled into an uneasy hush, the grandeur of the estate overshadowed by the spectre of murder. The guests, still confined under Inspector Grayson's orders, gathered in the dining room for a subdued supper, their appetites dulled by suspicion and fear. The long mahogany table, once a symbol of the Ashfords' hospitality, now seemed a stage for unspoken accusations, each guest avoiding the eyes of the others. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the end with her customary cup of tea, observed the scene with her quiet intensity, her knitting needles idle as her mind worked through the web of clues. Hercule Poirot, at the opposite end, maintained his air of fastidious calm, his sharp gaze missing nothing as he sipped his wine. The day's interrogations had left the household on edge, with Inspector Grayson's focus on Clara Ashford and Miss Eleanor Price stirring resentment and unease. Yet Miss Marple and Poirot, working in their own subtle ways, sensed that the truth lay not in the obvious suspects, but in the small, overlooked details, the kind that only a keen observer of human nature could discern. It was during this tense meal that a new clue emerged, one that would shift the investigation's course and deepen the mystery. As the servants cleared the main course, a young maid named Jenny approached Poirot, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Begging your pardon, sir," she whispered, glancing nervously at Sir Reginald, "but I found something in the library this morning, after the police searched it. I didn't know if it was important, but I thought you should see." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Show me, mademoiselle," he said, rising with a grace that belied the urgency in his tone. Miss Marple, sensing the significance of the moment, followed discreetly, her small frame blending into the shadows as the trio made their way to the library. Jenny led them to a bookshelf near the open window, where she pointed to a narrow gap between two volumes of Dickens. "It was tucked in here, sir," she said, producing a small folded piece of paper. "I only noticed it because the books were out of order, and I know how particular Sir Reginald is about his library." Poirot unfolded the paper with care, revealing a handwritten note in a neat, precise script. It read, "The king was in his counting house, counting out his money." Below the line, a single word was scrawled in red ink, "Lies." The note was unsigned, but its connection to the nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," was unmistakable. Miss Marple, peering over Poirot's shoulder, noted the faint scent of lavender clinging to the paper, a detail that stirred a memory she could not yet place. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, his fingers brushing his moustache. "Another piece of the rhyme. This is no coincidence, Mademoiselle Marple. The killer is weaving a narrative, a taunt for us to unravel." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing. "The word lies is significant, Monsieur Poirot. It suggests the killer believes someone, or something, is not what it seems. The counting house could point to money, to secrets, or to Sir Reginald himself, given his preoccupation with the estate's finances." Poirot's smile was approving. "You see clearly, mademoiselle. This note was hidden, yet meant to be found. The killer wishes to play a game, but they underestimate the little grey cells." They returned to the dining room, where the guests were finishing their meal. Poirot, with a theatrical flourish, held up the note for all to see. "Mes amis," he said, his voice commanding. "Attention! A new clue has come to light. A fragment of the nursery rhyme, hidden in the library, with a single word, 'lies.' I ask you, who among you knows of lies that might lead to murder?" The room fell silent, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Sir Reginald's face darkened, his fingers tightening around his glass. "This is preposterous," he said. "Some childish prank, nothing more." Childish, perhaps, Poirot replied, but deadly. The killer uses the rhyme to point us toward the truth, or to obscure it. I wonder, Sir Reginald, what lies you might know of concerning Captain Harrow or your family's affairs. Sir Reginald bristled, but before he could respond, Mrs. Lavinia Trent interjected, her voice sharp. I'll tell you about lies, Monsieur Poirot. Captain Harrow was no saint. I heard him talking to Clara in the garden yesterday. Something about a debt he owed, a debt he couldn't pay. Sounded like trouble to me. Clara's eyes flashed with anger. That's nonsense, Lavinia. Lionel was honest about his finances. He had no debts. Poirot's gaze flicked between them, noting the tension. A debt, Madame Trent? To whom? Mrs. Trent shrugged, her smirk infuriatingly vague. He didn't say, but he was nervous, I could tell. Maybe someone called in their marker. Miss Marple, watching quietly, noted the way Mr. Blake, the solicitor, shifted in his seat, his calm facade faltering for a moment. She recalled his reticence when questioned about the estate's finances, and wondered if he knew more about Harrow's affairs than he let on. As the meal concluded, Poirot and Miss Marple retired to the conservatory to discuss the new clue. The air was heavy with the scent of ferns and orchids, and the glass walls reflected the flickering light of a single lamp. The note is a deliberate act, Poirot said, pacing slowly. The killer wishes us to focus on lies, on money, but why? To distract us, or to reveal a truth? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. In my experience, Monsieur Poirot, money is often at the heart of such matters. But the lavender scent on the note, it reminds me of something Lady Beatrice said about her perfume. She wears lavender, you know, a gift from Clara. Could the note be hers? Poirot's eyebrows rose. An intriguing observation, mademoiselle. But Lady Beatrice was in her room during the murder, or so she claims. We must verify the alibis, the movements, the candlestick, the window, the rhyme. They are pieces, but the human heart is the key. They returned to the drawing room, where Inspector Grayson was reviewing his notes with Constable Perkins. Grayson, still fixated on Clara and Miss Price, dismissed the note as a distraction. We've got enough to hold Miss Ashford, he said, her motives clear, and her alibis shaky. She was in the drawing room, but no one can confirm exactly when. Poirot shook his head. Inspector, you chased the obvious, but the truth is subtler. The note, the rhyme, they point to a mind that plans, that manipulates. We must look beyond the surface. Miss Marple, her mind turning over the details, thought of the bruise on Harrow's wrist, the lipstick on his collar, and now the lavender-scented note. Each clue was a thread, and she sensed they were weaving toward a revelation. The killer, she knew, was among them, hiding behind a mask of politeness. Their motives cloaked in the nursery rhyme's cryptic verses. As the clock struck 9, echoing the hour of the murder, Miss Marple resolved to watch closely, for the next clue might be the one to unravel the entire tapestry of deceit. Chapter 7. More lies surface. The second day at St. Mary's Grange dawned with a heavy pall, the weight of Captain Lionel Harrow's murder pressing down on the household. Like the low clouds that clung to the countryside, the guests, still confined to the estate, moved through their routines with a weary tension, their polite facades fraying under the strain of suspicion. The drawing-room, where they gathered after breakfast, was a crucible of whispered accusations and guarded glances. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes sharp as she catalogued every nuance of behaviour. Hercule Poirot, his impeccable suit a stark contrast to the dishevelled air of the others, paced slowly, his mind clearly turning over the latest clue. The lavender-scented note with its cryptic message of lies. The discovery of the note, tucked behind the library's books, had shifted the investigation's focus, stirring unease among the guests. Inspector Grayson, still doggedly pursuing Clara Ashford and Mrs. Eleanor Price, saw the note as a distraction, but Poirot and Miss Marple recognized it as a deliberate thread in the killer's tapestry. The reference to the king was in his counting house suggested money, deception, or perhaps Sir Reginald himself, while the word lies pointed to hidden truths that were beginning to surface. As the morning progressed, Poirot requested a private audience with each guest, this time in the conservatory, where the humid air and lush greenery created an intimate, almost confessional atmosphere. Miss Marple, permitted to observe, took a seat near a potted fern, her presence so unobtrusive that the guests scarcely noticed her. Poirot's questions were precise, designed to probe the cracks in their stories, and it was during these interviews that the first significant lies began to unravel. Dr. Ernest Caldwell was the first to face Poirot's scrutiny. The doctor, his glasses slipping down his nose, fidgeted as he recounted his movements on the night of the murder. "I was in the drawing-room, as I told you," he said, his voice strained, "talking with the Reverend Ward about the parish fundraiser. I heard nothing until Miss Price's scream." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And yet, Doctor, the maid, Jenny mentioned seeing you near the library earlier that evening, adjusting your cufflinks with some agitation. What were you doing there?" Caldwell's face reddened. I was looking for a medical journal. I often browse the library when I visit. It's nothing unusual." "Curieux," Poirot said, his tone mild but piercing. "A medical journal. Yet you did not mention this before. And the lipstick on Captain Harrow's collar. Bright red, you said. Did you recognize it? Perhaps it belongs to someone in this house." Caldwell's hands shook slightly. "I don't know about lipstick, Monsieur Poirot. I'm a doctor, not a fashion expert." Miss Marple, listening quietly, noted the doctor's discomfort and the way his eyes darted toward the door, as if longing to escape. She recalled the faint smear of red on Harrow's collar, a detail that seemed to connect to the note's accusation of lies. Was Caldwell hiding an affair, or something more sinister? Next came Mr. Percival Blake, the solicitor, whose calm demeanour masked a growing unease. Poirot questioned him about the estate's finances, a subject Blake had previously avoided. "Sir Reginald's affairs are confidential," Blake said, his voice clipped. "I was with him in the study, as I've said, discussing routine matters. Routine matters that kept you late into the evening," Poirot said, his eyebrows raised. "And Captain Harrow's will, naming Miss Ashford as beneficiary, was that routine as well? Did you know of it?" Blake hesitated, a rare crack in his composure. "I advised Captain Harrow on certain legal matters, yes. The will was recent, drafted only last week, but I assure you, it was his idea." "And did Miss Ashford know?" Poirot pressed. Blake's lips tightened. "Not from me. Harrow was adamant about keeping it secret." Miss Marple's needles paused. Blake's reticence suggested he knew more than he was willing to share, perhaps about Harrow's financial dealings or the estate's precarious state. The counting house of the nursery rhyme, she thought, might well point to Blake's role as the keeper of the family's secrets. The interviews continued, each revealing new layers of deception. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, ever eager to stir the pot, admitted to overhearing a heated exchange between Harrow and Sir Reginald in the garden, not about wedding plans, but about a loan Harrow had requested. A loan Sir Reginald had refused. He was furious, Mrs. Trent said, her eyes gleaming. Called Reginald a miser, said he'd ruin Clara's future. Sir Reginald, when questioned, denied the loan outright. Harrow never asked for money, he said, his voice cold. Our discussion was about Clara's travel plans. He was reckless, wanting to take her abroad when the estate needs her here. Lady Beatrice, trembling under Poirot's gentle probing, admitted to knowing of Harrow's financial troubles, but insisted they were minor. He was a naval officer, not a banker, she said. Clara loved him regardless. Miss Eleanor Price, still shaken from Grayson's accusations, revealed a surprising detail. She had seen Captain Harrow speaking with Dr. Caldwell in the library before dinner, their voices low and urgent. I didn't hear what they said, she whispered, but Lionel looked worried. The Reverend Ward, the last to be questioned, maintained his pious calm, but Poirot's questions about his prayerful reflection in the conservatory drew a vague response. I was alone, seeking solace, he said. I saw no one, heard nothing. As the interviews concluded, Poirot and Miss Marple conferred in the conservatory, the scent of lavender lingering faintly in the air. The lies multiply, mademoiselle, Poirot said, his voice low. The doctor conceals his movements, the solicitor hides financial truths, and Mrs. Trent revels in discord. The nursery rhyme points to money, to deception, but whose? Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. The lavender scent on the note troubles me, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Beatrice wears it, but so might another to mislead us. And the bruise on Harrow's wrist. Someone grabbed him, perhaps to stop him from speaking. I wonder if Dr. Caldwell's conversation with him holds the key. Poirot's smile was approving. You see the human heart, mademoiselle. The bruise, the lipstick, the note. They are threads in a tapestry of lies. We must tug gently, lest the killer senses our approach. As they returned to the drawing-room, a new discovery sent a ripple of alarm through the household. Constable Perkins, searching the library again, found a small vial tucked behind a cushion on the sofa. A vial labelled laudanum, a potent sedative. Dr. Caldwell, summoned to examine it, confirmed it was his, kept in his medical bag for emergencies. It's missing a small amount, he said, his face pale. But I swear I didn't use it. The revelation cast a new shadow over the investigation. Had Harrow been drugged before the fatal blow, making him an easier target? And who had access to the doctor's bag? Inspector Grayson seized on the vial as evidence against Clara, but Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged a glance, both certain that the truth was far more complex. As the day drew to a close, the nursery rhyme's shadow loomed larger, its cryptic verses weaving through the lies that bound the guests together. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as ever, felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, drawing her closer to the heart of the killer's game. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The atmosphere at St. Mary's Grange had grown suffocating by the evening of the second day, the weight of suspicion pressing down on the guests like a physical force. The discovery of the laudanum vial had ignited fresh tensions, with Inspector Grayson's accusations against Clara Ashford and Miss Eleanor Price fueling whispered arguments and furtive glances. The drawing-room, where the group gathered after supper, was a tableau of frayed nerves, each guest grappling with the knowledge that a killer sat among them. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fireplace with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity, her eyes catching every flicker of emotion. Hercule Poirot, his impeccable composure unshaken, stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the darkened garden as if seeking answers in the shadows. The laudanum vial, with its implications of premeditation, had shifted the investigation's focus, but Poirot and Miss Marple suspected it was yet another thread in the killer's intricate web. The nursery rhyme clues, "Sing a song of sixpence," and "The king was in his counting-house," pointed to deception and money. But the emotional undercurrents of the household were beginning to surface, revealing cracks in the carefully constructed facades of its inhabitants. As the evening wore on, Poirot requested a private word with Clara Ashford in the conservatory, a setting he favoured for its intimacy and isolation. Miss Marple, invited to join, took her place among the ferns, her presence so unassuming that Clara scarcely noticed her. Poirot's tone was gentle but probing, his eyes fixed on Clara's face as he spoke. "Mademoiselle," he began, "you have maintained your composure admirably, but I sense a turmoil beneath. Tell me, what was the true nature of your relationship with Captain Harrow? The truth, s'il vous plaît?" Clara's defiance faltered, her eyes filling with tears. "I loved Lionel," she said, her voice breaking, "but he wasn't what everyone thought. He was charming, yes, but he had secrets. He owed money, large sums, to people he wouldn't name. He said it didn't matter, that the marriage would fix everything." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Fix everything? How so?" Clara hesitated, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. "He said my inheritance would cover his debts. Father was furious when he found out. Said Lionel was using me. We argued about it in the garden, but I didn't believe Father. I thought Lionel loved me." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Clara's words. The admission was a crack in the young woman's armour, revealing a motive for Sir Reginald, or even Clara herself, if betrayal had turned love to hate. But Clara's tears seemed genuine, and Miss Marple sensed there was more to her story. Before Poirot could press further, a commotion from the drawing-room interrupted them. Raised voices echoed down the hall, and the trio hurried back to find Mrs. Lavinia Trent standing in the centre of the room, her face flushed with indignation. "I've had enough of this," she declared, pointing a trembling finger at Lady Beatrice. "You all pretend to be so proper, but I know the truth. Beatrice, you were in love with Lionel years ago, before you married Reginald. Don't deny it." The room fell silent, the guests frozen in shock. Lady Beatrice's face drained of colour, her hands clutching her shawl as if to shield herself. "Lavinia, that's nonsense," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Sir Reginald rose, his eyes blazing. "How dare you, Lavinia, spreading lies at a time like this?" "Lies?" Mrs. Trent retorted, her voice sharp. "I saw the letters, Beatrice, years ago when I visited your family home. Love letters, hidden in a drawer signed by Lionel Harrow. You never got over him, did you?" Lady Beatrice swayed, and Clara rushed to her side, her own tears forgotten. "Mother, is this true?" she demanded. Beatrice's lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed she might collapse. Then, with a visible effort, she straightened. "It was a youthful infatuation," she said, her voice barely audible. "Long before I met your father, it meant nothing." Poirot stepped forward, his presence calming the chaos. "Madam," he said gently, "these letters, where are they now?" Beatrice shook her head. "Burned, years ago. Lavinia is mistaken. There's nothing to it." But Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Beatrice's hands trembled, the way her eyes avoided Clara's. The revelation was a turning point exposing a raw wound in the Ashford family's history. Had Beatrice's old feelings for Harrow resurfaced, fueling jealousy or resentment? Or was Mrs. Trent's accusation another red herring, designed to deflect suspicion? Poirot turned to Mrs. Trent, his gaze piercing. "Madame, you have a talent for uncovering secrets, but why reveal this now? What else do you know?" Mrs. Trent's smirk faltered, and she sat down abruptly, as if realizing she had said too much. "I just thought it was time the truth came out," she muttered. The room remained tense as the guests dispersed, the weight of Mrs. Trent's words lingering. Poirot and Miss Marple retired to the library, where the nursery rhyme book still lay open on the side table. Poirot flipped through its pages, pausing at 3 blind mice. "Another rhyme, perhaps?" he mused. "Or is Sing a Song of Sixpence the only thread?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The rhymes are a pattern, Monsieur Poirot. But the emotions, Clara's betrayal, Beatrice's past, they are the heart of this. The laudanum vial, the lipstick, the note, they all point to someone who knows the family's secrets intimately." Poirot nodded, his fingers brushing his moustache. "Oui, mademoiselle. The killer is close, perhaps too close. The lavender scent on the note, Lady Beatrice, or someone using her perfume to mislead us. And the bruise on Harrow's wrist, someone held him, perhaps to silence him before the fatal blow." As they discussed the clues, a soft knock interrupted them. Miss Eleanor Price stood at the door, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "Monsieur Poirot, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to tell you something. I lied about why I went to the library that night." Poirot gestured for her to sit, his expression encouraging. "Speak, mademoiselle. The truth, it is always the best path." Miss Price took a shaky breath. "I wasn't looking for a book. I went to meet Lionel. He asked me to come, said he needed to discuss something urgent. But when I got there, he was already dead. I swear, I didn't touch him." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what was this urgent matter, mademoiselle?" "I don't know," she said, tears spilling over. "He wouldn't say in his note. Just that it was about Clara. Something she needed to know before the wedding." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Miss Price's confession was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. What had Harrow wanted to tell her? And why had he chosen the governess, of all people, as his confidant? The nursery rhyme, the lies, the secrets, they were converging. And Miss Marple sensed the killer's mask was beginning to slip. As Miss Price left, sobbing quietly, Poirot turned to Miss Marple. "The emotional currents run deep, mademoiselle. The killer has stirred the waters, but we shall find the truth beneath." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already tracing the threads of deception. The stage was set for the next act, and the little grey cells of St. Mary Mead were ready to meet the challenge. Chapter 9. The Trap. The third day at St. Mary's Grange dawned with a brittle tension, the air thick with the unspoken fears of its inhabitants. The revelations of the previous evening, Clara's admission of Captain Harrow's debts, Lady Beatrice's youthful romance, and Miss Eleanor Price's confession about her secret meeting, had left the guests reeling, their carefully guarded secrets unravelling like threads from a worn tapestry. The drawing-room, where they gathered under Inspector Grayson's watchful eye, was a silent battleground of suspicion, each glance a silent accusation. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm, her eyes sharp as she observed the fraying composure of the group. Hercule Poirot, his impeccable suit a stark contrast to the dishevelled air of the others, moved with a quiet purpose. his mind clearly plotting the next move in the killer's intricate game. Poirot had decided that the time had come to apply pressure, to set a trap that would force the murderer to reveal themselves, or at least to make a mistake. The nursery rhyme clues, the laudanum vial, the lipstick, and the bruise on Harrow's wrist were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a calculating mind, one that thrived on deception. But Poirot, with his little grey cells and unerring sense of human nature, was ready to turn the killer's own game against them. After lunch, Poirot gathered the guests in the library, the scene of the crime, a choice that heightened the tension. The room, with its high shelves and heavy curtains, seemed to close in around them, the chalk outline of Harrow's body a grim reminder of the stakes. Inspector Grayson and Constable Perkins stood by the door, their presence a formality, for it was clear that Poirot was now steering the investigation. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace, watched with quiet anticipation, her knitting abandoned as she focused on the drama about to unfold. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, "we stand at a crossroads. A man is dead, struck down in this very room, and the killer is among us. The clues, the nursery rhyme, the laudanum, the lipstick, they are not random. They are the work of a mind that seeks to mock us, to hide the truth in plain sight. But Hercule Poirot does not play the fool. I propose a reconstruction of the night of the murder, to see what truths we may uncover." A murmur of unease rippled through the group. Sir Reginald's face darkened, Lady Beatrice clutched her shawl, and Clara's eyes darted nervously to her mother. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, ever defiant, scoffed. "A reconstruction? What nonsense is this, Monsieur Poirot? The police have their suspects. Why drag us through this charade?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Because, madame, the truth is often revealed in the act of remembering. Each of you will recount your movements from the end of dinner to the moment of Miss Price's scream. And I shall watch, for the truth, it is in the details." He began with Clara, asking her to describe her actions after dinner. "I was in the drawing room," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling, "talking with Mother and Mrs. Trent. I didn't leave until we heard the scream." Poirot nodded, then turned to Lady Beatrice. "And you, madame?" "You said you retired to your room, feeling unwell. How long were you there?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flickering. "Perhaps 10 minutes. I came back just before the scream." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. 10 minutes was a vague time frame, and Lady Beatrice's lavender-scented perfume lingered in her memory, tied to the note found in the library. Was her brief absence significant, or another distraction? Sir Reginald and Mr. Blake reiterated their alibi of being in the study, their accounts aligning perfectly, too perfectly, Miss Marple thought. Dr. Caldwell and the Reverend Ward repeated their story of discussing the parish fundraiser in the drawing room, though Caldwell's nervous fidgeting betrayed his unease. Miss Price, her voice barely audible, described her trip to the library to meet Harrow, only to find him dead. Poirot listened intently, his eyes moving from face to face, catching every hesitation, every glance. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he produced the nursery rhyme book, open to Sing-a-Song of Sixpence. "This book," he said, "is the killer's signature." The torn page, the note with lies, they point to a motive, a secret. I ask you now, who among you knows of a lie that Captain Harrow carried? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication, Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Blake spoke, his voice low but firm. "Harrow was not what he seemed," he said, his calm facade cracking. "I didn't want to say before, but he came to me last week, asking about a loan against Clara's inheritance. He was desperate, said he owed money to dangerous people. I refused, told him it wasn't possible without Sir Reginald's consent." The room erupted in gasps. Clara's face paled, and Sir Reginald's fists clenched. "You never told me this," he roared. "Why keep it secret?" Blake's eyes dropped. "I thought it was a private matter. I didn't want to cause trouble." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And yet, Monsieur Blake, trouble has found us. This debt, was it the reason for Harrow's death? Or is there another lie, one deeper still?" Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Trent stood, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "I'll tell you another lie," she cried. "Harrow wasn't just in debt. He was blackmailing someone in this house. I overheard him in the garden, talking to someone on the telephone. He said, 'Pay me, or I'll tell everyone what I know.' I don't know who it was, but he was smug, like he'd won." The revelation sent a shockwave through the group. Lady Beatrice swayed, and Clara's eyes filled with tears. Dr. Caldwell's glasses slipped further down his nose, and even the Reverend Ward looked shaken. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Miss Price's hands tightened in her lap, as if bracing for a blow. Poirot seized the moment, his voice rising. "Blackmail, mes amis, is a powerful motive. If Captain Harrow held a secret over someone's head, it could drive them to murder. I ask you now, who was his victim? Speak, or the little grey cells will find you out." The pressure was palpable, the guests shifting uncomfortably under Poirot's gaze. Then, in a moment that stunned the room, Miss Eleanor Price stood, her face ashen. "It was me," she whispered. "Lionel was blackmailing me. He knew something about my past, something I did years ago. He said he'd tell Clara unless I paid him." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavy. Poirot's eyes gleamed, but before he could speak, Miss Price collapsed into her chair, sobbing. "I didn't kill him, I swear. I went to the library to beg him to stop, but he was already dead." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The trap had worked, exposing a critical truth, but she sensed it was not the whole story. Miss Price's blackmail was a motive, but the nursery rhyme, the laudanum, the lipstick, they pointed to a larger pattern, one that was still obscured. As the guests dispersed, shaken by the revelations, Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. The killer was close, their mask slipping, but the final piece of the puzzle remained just out of reach. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The air in St. Mary's Grange was thick with anticipation. As the third evening descended, the weight of Captain Lionel Harrow's murder pressing ever more heavily on the confined guests. The library, where Hercule Poirot had chosen to stage his final confrontation, was lit by the soft glow of lamps, casting long shadows across the shelves and the chalk outline that still marked the spot of Harrow's death. The guests summoned by Poirot's request filed in with a mixture of dread and curiosity, their faces pale under the strain of the past days. Miss Jane Marple sat near the fireplace, her knitting needles still, her eyes sharp as she watched the gathering. Poirot stood by the desk, his impeccable posture and gleaming moustache a beacon of calm amid the storm of suspicion. The revelations of the previous day, Miss Eleanor Price's admission of blackmail, Mrs. Trent's accusation of Lady Beatrice's past, and Mr. Blake's disclosure of Harrow's financial desperation had cracked the veneer of civility, exposing raw motives and hidden truths. Inspector Grayson, still clinging to his theory of Clara Ashford's guilt, stood by the door with Constable Perkins, his notebook at the ready. But it was Poirot who commanded the room, his voice clear and resonant as he addressed the assembly. "Mes amis," he began, his eyes sweeping over the group, "we have reached the moment of truth. A man is dead, struck down in this very room, and the killer sits among us. The clues, the nursery rhyme, the laudanum, the lipstick, the note, they are not mere fragments, but threads in a tapestry woven by a mind both cunning and desperate. Tonight, Hercule Poirot will unravel this tapestry and reveal the murderer." A murmur of unease rippled through the room, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Let us begin with the facts. Captain Harrow was killed between 9:15 and 9:30, struck by a brass candlestick. The library window was open, suggesting an outsider, but the estate's isolation makes this unlikely. The laudanum vial, missing a small amount, indicates premeditation. The lipstick on Harrow's collar, bright red, points to a woman, or so we are meant to believe. And the nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," with its torn page and hidden note, is the killer's signature, a taunt to conceal or reveal their motive. Poirot paced slowly, his gaze moving from face to face. "We have heard many lies. Mademoiselle Clara, you hid Captain Harrow's debts, believing his love would overcome them. Sir Reginald, you concealed your anger at his financial demands. Lady Beatrice, you kept secret your youthful affection for him. Monsieur Blake, you withheld knowledge of his will. Mademoiselle Price, you admitted to his blackmail. And Madame Trent, you stirred discord with your accusations. But one lie is greater than all others. One lie led to murder." He paused, letting the tension build. "The nursery rhyme is the key. Sing a Song of Sixpence speaks of money, deception, and betrayal. The torn page, with 24 blackbirds, was found in the drawing room. The note, with the king, was in his counting house, and the word lies was hidden in the library. These are not random. They point to a motive rooted in wealth and secrets." Poirot turned to the nursery rhyme book, still open on the side table. The rhyme tells of a king counting his money, a queen eating bread and honey, a maid in the garden. But it is the blackbirds, symbols of deceit, that guide us. Captain Harrow was no king, but he was in a counting house of sorts, entangled in debts and blackmail. He threatened to expose a secret, one that would ruin someone in this house. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Dr. Ernest Caldwell's hands twitched, his glasses slipping down his nose. She recalled his nervous demeanour, his vague account of his movements, and the laudanum vial from his medical bag. Poirot, too, seemed to sense a shift, his eyes locking onto the doctor. "Dr. Caldwell," Poirot said, his voice sharp, "you have been most elusive. You were seen near the library before the murder, adjusting your cufflinks with agitation. You confirmed the laudanum was yours, yet claimed ignorance of its use. And the lipstick on Harrow's collar, bright red, like that worn by only one woman in this house, Mrs. Lavinia Trent." Mrs. Trent gasped, her hand flying to her lips. "That's outrageous! I never touched him!" Poirot's smile was serene. "No, madame, you did not. The lipstick was a misdirection, applied after death, to point suspicion toward you. But the laudanum, Doctor, that was your doing. You slipped it into Harrow's drink during dinner, knowing it would dull his senses, making him an easy target. And the bruise on his wrist? You grabbed him, perhaps to stop him from revealing your secret. Caldwell's face drained of colour, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This is nonsense! I'm a doctor, not a murderer." Poirot continued, undeterred. "Your secret, Doctor, is one of greed and betrayal. Captain Harrow discovered that you were falsifying medical records for profit, overcharging Sir Reginald for treatments never given. He blackmailed you, threatening to expose you unless you paid. But you could not pay, not without risking your reputation. So you planned his death, using the nursery rhyme to cast suspicion elsewhere." He turned to the group, his voice rising. "The torn page was your first clue, Doctor, placed to suggest a prank. The note, scented with Lady Beatrice's lavender to implicate her, was your second. You opened the window to suggest an outsider, and you used the candlestick, a heavy, unlikely weapon, to make the act seem impulsive. But the laudanum was your mistake. Only you had access to it, and only you had the knowledge to use it." Caldwell stood, his hands shaking. "You have no proof. This is all conjecture." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Non, Doctor. The maid Jenny saw you near the library, and the laudanum vial bears your fingerprints. The note's handwriting matches your prescription pad found in your room. And the bruise on Harrow's wrist, it matches the grip of a man desperate to silence his blackmailer." The room was silent, the guests staring at Caldwell as his composure collapsed. With a cry, he bolted for the door, but Constable Perkins seized him, pinning his arms. "I didn't mean to kill him," Caldwell sobbed. "He was going to ruin me. I only wanted to scare him. But he laughed, said I was weak. I grabbed the candlestick. I didn't mean it." Poirot nodded, his expression sombre. "The human heart, Doctor, is a fragile thing. Your greed and fear led you to murder, and the nursery rhyme was your attempt to hide it. But the truth, it always finds a way." As Caldwell was led away, the guests sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Miss Marple, her eyes soft with understanding, met Poirot's gaze. The little grey cells had triumphed, unravelling the killer's game with precision and insight. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The revelation of Dr. Ernest Caldwell's guilt had left St. Mary's Grange in a state of quiet shock, the oppressive tension of the past days giving way to a sombre stillness. The library, where Hercule Poirot had unmasked the killer, seemed to exhale, its heavy curtains and towering shelves no longer suffocating, but merely melancholic. The guests released from the immediate threat of suspicion gathered in the drawing room, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and unease. The murder of Captain Lionel Harrow had been solved, but the wounds it had exposed, secrets, betrayals, and hidden resentments, lingered like shadows in the grand estate. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fireplace, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, though her hands moved more slowly now, as if in deference to the gravity of the moment. Hercule Poirot stood by the window, his impeccable figure silhouetted against the fading light of the late afternoon, his eyes distant but thoughtful. Inspector Grayson and Constable Perkins had departed with Dr. Caldwell in custody, leaving the household to grapple with the aftermath. The nursery rhyme, the laudanum, the lipstick, all had been explained, yet Poirot and Miss Marple knew that the resolution of a crime was never the end of its story. The guests, though free to leave, lingered in the drawing-room, as if reluctant to break the fragile bond forged by shared ordeal. Clara Ashford sat beside her mother, Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, the sapphire engagement ring now removed from her finger. Sir Reginald, his stern demeanour softened by exhaustion, stood by the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed on the fire. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, for once subdued, sipped her tea in silence, while Mr. Percival Blake, the solicitor, leafed through a newspaper with an air of distraction. Miss Eleanor Price, her eyes red from crying, sat alone, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The Reverend Thomas Ward murmured a prayer, his voice a low hum of comfort. Poirot turned from the window, his expression one of quiet reflection. "Mes amis," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "The puzzle is solved, the killer unmasked. Dr. Caldwell's greed and fear drove him to murder, and his clever use of the nursery rhyme was meant to mislead us. But the truth, it always reveals itself to those who seek it with clarity and patience." Clara looked up, her voice trembling. "But why, Monsieur Poirot? Why did he use the nursery rhyme? It seems so cruel." Poirot's eyes softened. The mind of the criminal, mademoiselle, is often a theatre of its own making. Dr. Caldwell chose Sing a Song of Sixpence, not merely to taunt, but to reflect his own turmoil. The king in his counting-house was his perception of Sir Reginald, hoarding wealth he could not access. The blackbirds were the secrets he manipulated, Captain Harrow's debts, Mademoiselle Price's past. The rhyme was his way of asserting control, of mocking those he envied. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "In my village, Monsieur Poirot, I have seen how small things, gossip, envy, pride, can grow into great wrongs. Dr. Caldwell was not so different from the people of St. Mary Mead. His weakness was his need to feel superior, to outwit those around him. The rhyme was his flourish, his signature." Lady Beatrice, her voice barely above a whisper, spoke for the first time since the revelation. "And my letters, the lavender scent on the note, was that all to make me look guilty?" Poirot inclined his head. "Oui, madame. The lavender was a cruel touch, meant to cast suspicion on you or Mademoiselle Clara. Dr. Caldwell knew of your past with Captain Harrow, perhaps from village gossip or old records. He used it to muddy the waters, to make us question your motives." Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. "The man was a scoundrel, preying on our trust. I should have seen it, his overcharges, his sly manner. I failed my family." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You mustn't blame yourself, Sir Reginald. The human heart is a complex thing, and even the best of us can be deceived. What matters now is healing for you and Clara." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I thought I loved Lionel, but he was using me, wasn't he? His debts, his secrets, it was all about money." Poirot's expression was kind. "Love, mademoiselle, can blind us to truth, but it also gives us strength to move forward. You are young, and your heart will mend." As the conversation turned to quieter matters, Poirot and Miss Marple stepped into the garden. The cool evening air, a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the house. The roses, heavy with dew, glowed faintly in the twilight, and the distant hum of bees provided a soothing counterpoint to the day's intensity. "You were magnificent, Monsieur Poirot," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "Your trap was perfectly set. drawing out Dr. Caldwell's confession. I confess, I suspected him, but the lipstick and the laudanum clouded my thoughts for a time. Poirot's smile was modest, and you, mademoiselle, were a formidable ally. Your observation of the lavender scent, your insight into the human heart, these were as vital as my little grey cells. Together, we have brought order to chaos. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that the smallest details, a glance, a word, a scent, can reveal the greatest truths. Dr. Caldwell thought himself clever, but he underestimated the power of observation. Poirot nodded, his gaze distant. The criminal always underestimates mademoiselle. They believe their secrets are safe, but the truth, it is like a seed, it grows, it breaks through. We, you and I, are merely gardeners tending to its growth. As they returned to the house, the clock in the hall struck 7, its chimes echoing through the silent corridors. The guests were preparing to depart, their bags packed, their farewells subdued. Miss Marple and Poirot, their work done, would soon follow, leaving St. Mary's Grange to heal its wounds. But for Miss Marple, the case lingered in her mind, a reminder of the fragility of human nature and the quiet strength of those who seek justice. As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The Nursery Rhyme Killer had been unmasked, and the little grey cells, hers and Poirot's, had prevailed. Chapter 12. A Lingering Doubt. The morning after Dr. Ernest Caldwell's confession, St. Mary's Grange seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the unmasking of the killer had lifted a weight from its ancient walls. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the lawns, and the bird song that drifted through the open windows carried a hint of renewal. Yet, beneath this fragile calm, a subtle unease persisted among the guests, their relief tempered by the lingering echoes of betrayal and deception. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the quiet interactions with her usual keenness, her mind not entirely at rest. Hercule Poirot, his polished shoes gleaming in the sunlight, stood by the terrace door, his expression one of quiet contemplation, as if sensing that the tapestry of the crime was not yet fully unravelled. The guests, though free to depart, lingered at the Grange, their plans delayed by a mix of exhaustion and reluctance to leave the scene of such upheaval. Clara Ashford, her face pale but resolute, sat with her mother, Lady Beatrice, their conversation low and earnest. Sir Reginald, his stern demeanour softened by the ordeal, was in the study with Mr. Percival Blake, discussing the estate's future. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her sharp tongue momentarily subdued, leafed through a magazine, while Miss Eleanor Price, still shaken by her role in the drama, sat alone, her hands folded tightly. The Reverend Thomas Ward moved among them, offering words of comfort, though his own eyes betrayed a lingering disquiet. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the nursery rhyme, the laudanum, and the lipstick, details that had pointed to Dr. Caldwell, but left her with a nagging sense of incompletion. The case, though solved, felt too neatly tied, as if a thread remained loose, hidden in the intricate weave of motives and secrets. She glanced at Poirot, who caught her eye and gave a slight nod, as if sharing her unspoken doubt. Poirot addressed the group, his voice calm, but carrying a subtle edge. "Mes amis, the murderer has been apprehended, and order has been restored. Yet, I sense a question remains in your minds, a question, perhaps, about the nursery rhyme itself. Why did Dr. Caldwell choose it? Was it merely a flourish, or does it hold a deeper truth? Mrs. Trent looked up, her eyes narrowing. You said it was his way of mocking us, Monsieur Poirot. But I've been thinking, those rhymes, they're about betrayal, aren't they? Blackbirds baked in a pie, a maid losing her nose. It feels personal. Poirot's moustache twitched. A perceptive observation, madame. The rhyme was indeed personal, but not only to Dr. Caldwell. It was chosen to resonate with someone else in this house, to stir a memory or a fear. I wonder, who among you felt its sting? The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to a detail she had overlooked. The torn page of Sing a Song of Sixpence had been underlined in red ink, a colour that matched the lipstick on Harrow's collar. Dr. Caldwell had admitted to planting the lipstick to implicate Mrs. Trent, but the red ink, had it been his doing, or someone else's? She recalled a fleeting moment during the interviews when Miss Price had adjusted her scarf, revealing a glimpse of a red fountain pen tucked into her pocket. Before Poirot could press further, Miss Price stood, her face pale, but her voice steady. Monsieur Poirot, Miss Marple, she said, her eyes darting nervously, there's something I didn't tell you. It's not about the murder, but it might matter. The nursery rhyme page, the one torn out, I saw it before dinner on the drawing-room table, but it wasn't underlined then. Someone added the red ink later. The room fell silent, the guests exchanging startled glances. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. Curieux, mademoiselle. And this red ink, you recognized it? Miss Price hesitated, then nodded. It looked like the ink from my pen. I keep it for marking lessons, but I swear, I didn't touch the page. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The red ink was a new thread, one that suggested another hand in the killer's game. Had Dr. Caldwell acted alone, or was there a second player manipulating the clues to deepen the deception? She glanced at Poirot, who was already moving toward the nursery rhyme book, still on the library's side table. Poirot opened the book, flipping to the page of Sing a Song of Sixpence. The rhyme, he said, speaks of deception, but also of surprise. The blackbirds bursting from the pie. Perhaps our killer had an accomplice, someone who added the red ink to ensure the rhyme's message was clear. Sir Reginald, his patience wearing thin, interjected. This is absurd, Poirot. Caldwell confessed. He acted alone. Why stir up more trouble? Poirot's smile was serene, because, Sir Reginald, the truth is like a diamond. It must be examined from every angle to reveal its brilliance. The red ink, the lavender scent, the open window, these are not all Caldwell's doing. Someone else touched the clues, perhaps to protect themselves, perhaps to obscure another truth. Miss Marple, her mind racing, spoke softly. In my village, I've seen how people hide small wrongs to protect greater ones. The red ink could be a sign of fear, of someone trying to shift blame. Miss Price, you said Captain Harrow wanted to tell you something about Clara. Did he hint at who else might be involved? Miss Price's hands trembled. He only said it was about her safety, that someone close to her wasn't what they seemed. I thought he meant himself, but now I'm not sure. The revelation sent a ripple of unease through the room. Clara's eyes widened, and Lady Beatrice clutched her daughter's hand. Mrs. Trent's smirk returned, as if she sensed fresh scandal. Mr. Blake, however, remained silent, his face unreadable. Poirot turned to the group, his voice firm. The nursery rhyme was a mask, but it has slipped. Someone in this house added the red ink, knowing it would draw attention to the rhyme. I ask you now, confess, or the little grey cells will find you out. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Mr. Blake's fingers tightened around his newspaper. The slight tremor in his hand. The solicitor, she thought, had been too quiet. His alibi too perfect. Had he added the red ink to ensure suspicion fell on Mrs. Trent? Or was he protecting a deeper secret tied to the estate's finances? As the guests dispersed, Poirot and Miss Marple retreated to the conservatory, the scent of ferns heavy in the air. "The red ink is a new clue, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice low. Caldwell's confession was truthful, but incomplete. Someone else played a part, perhaps not in the murder, but in its concealment. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. The rhyme is a mirror, reflecting the fears of this house. Mr. Blake, I think, knows more than he says. His silence is not innocence, it's calculation. Poirot's smile was approving. We are of one mind, mademoiselle. Tomorrow we shall tug this final thread, and the truth will be ours. As they parted, the clock struck noon. Its chimes a reminder that time was running out for the secrets of St. Mary's Grange to remain hidden. Chapter 13. The Second Thread. The fourth morning at St. Mary's Grange dawned with a deceptive calm, the golden sunlight filtering through the tall windows, unable to dispel the lingering unease that clung to the estate. The unmasking of Dr. Ernest Caldwell as Captain Lionel Harrow's killer had brought a measure of closure. But the revelation of the red ink on the nursery rhyme page had stirred fresh doubts, suggesting a second hand in the intricate web of deception. The guests, though preparing to depart, moved with a cautious hesitancy, their glances wary as they gathered in the drawing-room for morning tea. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fireplace, her knitting needles moving slowly, her eyes sharp as she observed the subtle currents of tension. Hercule Poirot, his polished demeanour as impeccable as ever, stood near the terrace door, his gaze thoughtful, as he contemplated the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple's mind returned to the red ink, a detail that had unsettled her since Miss Eleanor Price's confession about the nursery rhyme page. Dr. Caldwell had admitted to planting the torn page and the lavender-scented note, but the Whodunit red ink, matching Miss Price's fountain pen, suggested another player, someone who had subtly altered the killer's narrative. Poirot, too, sensed that the case was not fully closed, his little grey cells probing the edges of a truth that remained just out of reach. Poirot addressed the group, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority. "Mes amis, we have unmasked a murderer, but a shadow remains over St. Mary's Grange. The red ink on the nursery rhyme page was not Dr. Caldwell's doing. It was added later by someone who wished to shape our perception of the crime. I ask you now, who among you touched the page, and why?" The question drew a sharp intake of breath from the guests. Clara Ashford's eyes widened, her hands clutching her teacup. Lady Beatrice, pale and fragile, looked away, while Sir Reginald's jaw tightened, his impatience barely concealed. Mrs. Lavinia Trent's smirk faltered, and Mr. Percival Blake, the solicitor, adjusted his glasses with a nervous twitch. Miss Price, her face flushed, stared at her hands. while the Reverend Thomas Ward murmured a prayer under his breath. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Mr. Blake's fingers trembled, his calm facade cracking under Poirot's scrutiny. The solicitor had been too quiet, his alibi with Sir Reginald too neatly aligned, and his reticence about the estate's finances hinted at a deeper involvement. She recalled his discomfort when questioned about Captain Harrow's will, and a suspicion began to form. A suspicion that the red ink was not just a distraction, but a desperate act to protect a hidden truth. Before anyone could respond, Poirot turned to Miss Price, his tone gentle but probing. "Mademoiselle Price, you said the red ink matched your pen, yet you claim you did not touch the page. Tell me, did you see anyone else near the drawing-room table before dinner, when the page was first found?" Miss Price hesitated. Her eyes darted to Mr. Blake. I saw Mr. Blake in the drawing-room, just before we went in to dine. He was near the table, looking at some papers. I thought nothing of it at the time." Blake's face paled, and he rose, his voice sharp. "That's nonsense! I was merely tidying my notes. I had no interest in any nursery rhyme." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Curieux, Monsieur Blake. You are a man of precision, yet you seem unsettled by a simple observation. Let us consider the facts. Captain Harrow sought a loan against Mademoiselle Clara's inheritance, a request you refused. You knew of his debts, his blackmail of Dr. Caldwell, and perhaps other secrets. The red ink, it points to you. A mark to shift suspicion, perhaps to Madame Trent, whose lipstick was meant to mislead us." Blake's hands clenched, his composure fraying. "This is absurd, Poirot. I had no reason to meddle with the rhyme. Caldwell was the killer. You said so yourself." "Oui," Poirot said, his voice smooth. "But the killer had help. However, unwitting. The red ink was your addition, Monsieur Blake, to ensure the rhyme drew attention away from your own secrets. You see, I have made inquiries. The estate's accounts, which you manage, show discrepancies. Funds siphoned off over years. Small enough to go unnoticed, but significant in total. Captain Harrow discovered this, did he not? He threatened to expose you, just as he blackmailed Dr. Caldwell." The room fell silent, the guests staring at Blake in shock. Sir Reginald's face darkened, his voice low and dangerous. "Is this true, Percival? Have you been stealing from us?" Blake's shoulders slumped, his resistance crumbling. "It wasn't stealing," he said, his voice barely audible. I borrowed funds, intending to repay them. The estate was failing, Reginald. You know it. I thought I could save it, invest the money wisely. Harrow found out, demanded a share to keep quiet. I refused, but I didn't kill him." "And the red ink?" Poirot pressed. "Why mark the page?" Blake's eyes filled with tears. "I saw the torn page after dinner, before the murder. I thought it was Caldwell's doing, a prank to stir trouble. I underlined it in red to make it seem more significant, to point the police toward him. I didn't know he'd kill Harrow. I just wanted to protect myself." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind piecing together the final thread. Blake's confession explained the red ink, but it also revealed the depth of the estate's financial woes, a motive that had driven both Caldwell and Blake to desperate measures. The nursery rhyme, she realized, was not just Caldwell's signature, but a mirror reflecting the greed and fear that permeated the Grange. Poirot nodded, his expression sombre. "You did not strike the blow, Monsieur Blake, but your actions muddied the truth, endangering others. The red ink was your mistake, a mark of your guilt." Sir Reginald stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "You've betrayed us, Percival. All these years I trusted you." Clara, tears streaming down her face, turned to her father. "It's not just him, father. We've all been hiding things, Lionel's debts, mother's past, my own blindness. This house is built on secrets." Lady Beatrice reached for her daughter's hand, her voice soft. "We'll rebuild, Clara, together." As Blake was led away by Constable Perkins, who had been summoned to take his statement, the guests sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple and Poirot exchanged a glance, their shared understanding unspoken but profound. The case was closed, but its lessons lingered. The fragility of trust, the cost of greed, and the power of small details to reveal great truths. As the group dispersed, Poirot turned to Miss Marple, his smile warm. "You saw the thread, mademoiselle, as clearly as I. The red ink was the key, and your insight guided us to it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "In Saint Mary Mead, Monsieur Poirot, I've learned that the smallest act, a word, a glance, a mark, can betray the heart's secrets. We have done our work here." The clock in the hall struck 11. Its chimes a quiet farewell to the turmoil of St. Mary's Grange. The truth had been laid bare, and the nursery rhyme's shadow was lifted at last. Chapter 14. The Unravelling Tapestry. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over St. Mary's Grange, its golden rays filtering through the drawing-room windows and softening the edges of a house that had been steeped in suspicion for days. The unmasking of Dr. Ernest Caldwell as the murderer and Mr. Percival Blake as his unwitting accomplice had brought a resolution to the tragedy of Captain Lionel Harrow's death. Yet the air remained heavy with the aftertaste of betrayal. The guests, now free to leave, lingered in the drawing-room, their bags packed, but their hearts still tethered to the secrets that had unravelled. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with a gentle rhythm, her eyes quietly observant as she watched the group navigate the delicate process of departure. Hercule Poirot stood by the terrace door, his impeccable figure a study in calm, though his sharp gaze suggested he, too, sensed the lingering echoes of the case. The revelation of Blake's financial misconduct had shaken the Ashford family to its core, exposing the fragility of their legacy and the hidden motives that had fueled the tragedy. Clara Ashford, her face drawn but resolute, sat beside her mother, Lady Beatrice, their hands clasped in a silent pact of renewal. Sir Reginald, his stern demeanour softened by the weight of recent events, stood by the mantelpiece, his eyes fixed on a portrait of his ancestors, as if seeking guidance from the past. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her usual sharpness dulled, sipped her tea in silence, while Miss Eleanor Price, still fragile from her role in the drama, sat alone, her hands folded tightly. The Reverend Thomas Ward moved among them, offering quiet words of solace, though his own expression carried a trace of melancholy. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," which had woven through the case like a thread through a tapestry. The torn page, the lavender-scented note, the red ink, they had all pointed to Doctor Caldwell's guilt, but Blake's addition of the ink had revealed a secondary layer of deception, a desperate act to protect his own secrets. Yet, even now, Miss Marple felt a faint unease, a sense that the tapestry was not entirely complete. The rhyme, with its talk of blackbirds and counting-houses, seemed to echo beyond Caldwell and Blake, touching on deeper truths about the Grange and its inhabitants. Poirot, sensing the same undercurrent, addressed the group, his voice clear and measured. "Mes amis, the crime is solved, the guilty apprehended." Dr. Caldwell struck the fatal blow, driven by greed and fear, and Monsieur Blake, with his red stylo ink, sought to shield his own transgressions. Yet I wonder, does the nursery rhyme still speak to us? Its verses, they're not merely clues but mirrors, reflecting the secrets of this house. Is there more we have yet to see? The question drew a hush over the room, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Clara looked up, her voice soft but steady. "Monsieur Poirot, you've given us the truth about Lionel's death, but what about us? This house, our family, it's been torn apart by lies. How do we move forward?" Poirot's eyes softened, a rare warmth in his expression. "Mademoiselle, the truth, it is painful, but it is also a foundation. You and your family have faced the shadows. Now you may build anew. The nursery rhyme, it was a taunt, but also a lesson. Deception, left unchecked, breeds destruction." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "In my village, Mademoiselle Clara, I've seen families weather great storms. The Grange is wounded, but it is strong. You and your parents will find a way, if you face the truth together." Lady Beatrice, her voice trembling, spoke for the first time that day. "I hid my past with Lionel, thinking it would protect Clara, but it only caused pain. I should have been honest." Sir Reginald placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gruff but gentle. "We've all made mistakes, Beatrice. I trusted Blake, ignored the signs of his betrayal. But Clara's right, we need to rebuild." Mrs. Trent, her usual venom absent, set down her teacup. "I stirred trouble, I admit it. I thought exposing secrets would protect us, but it only made things worse. I'm sorry, Beatrice." The apology, unexpected and sincere, drew a soft gasp from Clara. Miss Price, her eyes brimming, added quietly, "I hid my past, too, fearing judgment. If I'd spoken sooner, perhaps Lionel wouldn't have used it against me." The room fell silent, the weight of their confessions settling like dust after a storm. Poirot, his gaze sweeping over the group, spoke with quiet authority. "The human heart, it is complex, full of light and shadow. The nursery rhyme exposed your secrets, but it also brought you to this moment of truth. You have faced the darkness. Now you may seek the light." Miss Marple, her knitting needles still, felt a quiet satisfaction. The case had been more than a murder. It had been a revelation of the Grange's hidden wounds. A chance for its inhabitants to confront their past and choose a different future. She thought of the red ink, Blake's desperate act, and how it had inadvertently helped unravel the truth. The nursery rhyme, she realized, was not just the killer's tool, but a catalyst for healing, forcing the family to face what they had long buried. As the guests began to prepare for their departure, Poirot and Miss Marple stepped into the garden, the air cool and fragrant with roses. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the estate, and the distant hum of bees provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "You were right, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice low. "The red ink was the key to the second thread, revealing Monsieur Blake's role. Your insight into the human heart, it is unmatched." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And your precision, Monsieur Poirot, is a marvel. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that secrets, like weeds, must be uprooted to let the garden grow. We've done that here, I think." Poirot nodded, his smile warm. "Oui, mademoiselle. The little grey cells. They work best when guided by compassion. The Grange will heal, and we have played our part." As they returned to the house, the clock in the hall struck 4, its chimes a gentle reminder of time's passage. The guests were saying their farewells, their voices softer now, tinged with hope. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her heart light with the knowledge that justice had been served, not just in catching a killer, but in giving a family a chance to mend. Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The final day at St. Mary's Grange dawned with a serene clarity, the morning light filtering through the ancient oaks and bathing the estate in a soft, forgiving glow. The turmoil of the past days, the murder of Captain Lionel Harrow, the unmasking of Dr. Ernest Caldwell, and the revelation of Mr. Percival Blake's complicity, had left the household chastened but resolute, ready to move forward from the shadows of deceit. The guests, their bags packed and their farewells spoken, gathered in the hall for a final moment of parting, their voices subdued but tinged with a tentative hope. Miss Jane Marple stood near the grand staircase, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her eyes warm with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Hercule Poirot, his suit as impeccable as ever, adjusted his hat with a precise gesture, his expression one of calm fulfillment as he prepared to depart. The drawing-room, so recently a stage for suspicion and accusation, now felt lighter, as if the air itself had been cleansed by the truth. Clara Ashford, her face still pale, but her eyes clear, stood with her parents, Sir Reginald and Lady Beatrice, their unity a silent testament to their resolve to rebuild. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her sharp tongue softened by her apology, offered a rare smile as she shook hands with the others. Miss Eleanor Price, though still fragile, carried herself with a newfound dignity. Her past no longer a weight but a lesson. The Reverend Thomas Ward, his prayers now heartfelt, blessed the group with a gentle sincerity, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm's aftermath. Poirot addressed the gathering one last time, his voice resonant with authority and compassion. "Mes amis, we have faced a great darkness here at St. Mary's Grange, but from darkness comes light. The nursery rhyme, with its blackbirds and counting houses, was a mirror to your secrets, but it has also shown you the path to truth. Dr. Caldwell's greed and Monsieur Blake's fear led to tragedy, but your courage in facing these truths has set you free. Go now and live with honesty." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "Monsieur Poirot, Miss Marple, we owe you so much. You saw through the lies, not just of the killer but of all of us. I thought I'd lost everything, but now I see a way forward." Lady Beatrice, her hand resting on Clara's arm, nodded. "You've given us a chance to heal, to be a family again." "Thank you, Sir Reginald." His stern features softened, added gruffly, "I misjudged you both. I thought this house was doomed, but you've shown us it can endure." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "In my village of St. Mary Mead, I've seen many hearts tested by secrets. The Grange is no different. You have faced your shadows, and now you may walk in the light. Remember the lessons of the nursery rhyme, not its deceit, but its call to truth." Mrs. Trent, her usual bravado absent, offered a rare moment of humility. "I stirred trouble, and I'm sorry for it. You've shown me that truth isn't a weapon, but a bridge." Miss Price, her voice barely above a whisper, added, I was afraid of my past, but you've helped me see it doesn't define me. I can start again." The Reverend Ward, his eyes warm, concluded, "May we all find peace in the truth you've uncovered." As the guests began to depart, their cars pulling away down the gravel drive, Poirot and Miss Marple lingered in the hall. The grandeur of the Grange now softened by the promise of renewal. The clock struck 10, its chimes a gentle farewell to the drama that had unfolded within these walls. Outside, in the garden, Poirot and Miss Marple took a final turn among the roses, the air fragrant with their scent, and the hum of bees a soothing counterpoint to the quiet. Poirot adjusted his hat, his smile warm. "Mademoiselle Marple, you have been a partner sans pareil. Your insight into the human heart, your attention to the smallest details, these were as vital as my little grey cells." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with amusement. "And you, Monsieur Poirot, have a mind like a finely tuned clock, precise and relentless. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that truth often hides in plain sight in the ordinary moments. Together, we found it here." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. The nursery rhyme was the killer's game, but it became our triumph. The red ink, the lavender, the lipstick, they were threads, but it was the heart that wove them together. We have brought order to chaos, and that is a victory. As they walked toward the waiting car that would take them from the Grange, Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the estate's ivy-clad walls. "This house will stand, Monsieur Poirot, because its people have chosen truth over secrets. That is the greatest legacy we leave them." Poirot bowed slightly, his eyes gleaming with respect. "Well said, mademoiselle. The little grey cells, they work best when guided by wisdom such as yours." With a final glance at St. Mary's Grange, they stepped into the car, the engine's hum blending with the morning's calm. The Nursery Rhyme Killer had been defeated, not by force, but by the quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. As the car pulled away, Miss Marple clutched her knitting bag, her heart light with the knowledge that justice had been served. And Poirot, beside her, smiled, content in the order they had restored.